Okay, good evening, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started with our second um, Zoom session for 513. And I am excited to talk with you about this unit. This is actually my favorite unit of all of our neurophysiology units and even some of our developmental stuff. So looking forward to it. We've got about an hour and a half this evening. So if we get done early, that's fine. Some of it will depend on how much discussion that we have. But I am very interested in seeing how you all are coming along with the CTEs. And the format of this evening's class will be just some kind of general overview points for the CTE, see if you all have any questions, because I'm sure all of that is kind of first and foremost in your minds, with that being due in just a couple of hours if you haven't submitted it already. And then we're going to do just a little bit of lecture because I really do want to leave some time for kind of informal discussion around some of this material and especially the CTE context and everything. So that's pretty much going to be the plan for today. So I would like to start out just with a few kind of tips and thoughts about the CTEs. I've gotten some questions just based on in-class discussion with my face-to-face students, as well as some emails from students that I've gotten. It definitely seems like the fact that you all are turning this in for a grade may be a little bit stressful, which is normal and understandable. So everybody just kind of take a deep breath and know that that's okay to be expected, very normal. But I promise you that there's no replacement for just kind of muscling through and doing the work. It can be a little bit overwhelming maybe, or just sort of feeling like some of the questions I've gotten are along the lines of just not really knowing where to start even, and just figuring out, well, how do I connect the dots between everything that I'm reading and then everything that's on the, basically the CTE prompt. So Hurricane Katrina, and kind of what's the audience? Last week you were asking me to talk to the parents, and now this is more of a general discussion. So all great questions. What I have to say about that is, you only have 250 words. So I, of course, don't expect, what I would expect for 5,000 words. So in 250 words, I think that you can pick an angle or a perspective around these topics that you are specifically passionate about. And like we kind of talked about in the first class, if you can overlay this material with something that you're passionate about, I think it will be more meaningful to you, and you will hopefully remember it more as well. So there are some ideas in the CTE, it specifically talks about, parenting, children and families. You could talk about displaced persons, trauma, homelessness. A lot of those folks had to live in a hotel for a number of weeks, if not months, and trailers, or there's a lot of issues with just some of the demographic makeup of those who were kind of disproportionately impacted by just the hurricane itself and what that recovery looked like. Many people came from I think some of the reports said over 1.5 times the federal poverty line. So you had a lot of people impacted who were already coming from places of poverty. So, so what does that do? And how does and really the whole crux of the CTE is, how does our physiological response to stress impact such a, how does that kind of come into play when you have such a traumatic situation? Is everybody going to respond? Does everybody respond to that trauma the same way? There's about 700,000 people, I think, that were impacted by Katrina. Do you have, 700,000 similar responses? If so, why? If not, why not? What are those individual variations that may come into play that are based on some of those genetic and epigenetic things that we've been covering over the last couple of weeks? So, you have an opportunity to even do things like look for media reports that are, about a specific case study, or you can just talk about things more generally. Case study of like a person. So this, mom had a 2-year-old and she was displaced and had to move to Houston, or, there's just, you just have, essentially my point is you have a lot of creative license. So I'm not expecting, 25 CTEs that are all going to look very similar. I will expect yours to be different. That's okay. That's exciting. And I think that, at least I hope that it will be more meaningful to you if it's, if you really kind of focus on something that you're passionate about. So those are some of the general questions that I've been getting. One other kind of APA related question I got was about the use of secondary sources. And that is definitely something that, I would encourage you to shy away from. It's not, there are ways to do that, to cite that appropriately in a longer paper, but since you only have 250 words, I wouldn't recommend that. And essentially that is when you have, say, Smith in 2010 published an article and was referring to and referencing within his article Johnson in 2008. But what you wanted to cite in your paper was actually from Johnson in 2008, but it was in the Smith 2010 article. So if you were to cite Johnson directly without pulling that Johnson article yourself and reading it, that would be what's called a secondary source. And it's very, I can see how there's many examples where that may happen for you. And I just want to encourage you to go on and pull that original article and cite that directly so that you don't get into some of the technicalities of how you would have to cite that appropriately within such a short period, which is in such a short paper. So I hope that makes sense. Maybe a little confusing, maybe a little bit new to you, but there's often times where one author will cite something that you really want to cite, and it's always best for you to just go on and pull that original source, is the point. Are there any questions from those of you? We've got about 14 folks online right now. Are there any questions that you all have just about the CTE in general, or any kind of course content? Any questions? Hi.
I do. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have a question about general information. What is considered widespread kind of general knowledge and versus specific sources? Like, we're dealing with social issues, so there's a lot of coverage on a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I read somewhere where if you can find 5 independent sources talking about the same thing, then it's kind of considered general information. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I would just say, some of it just depends on, it's kind of hard to say without a specific example. If you want to share an example, that may be really helpful to other students. Or
the demographic that was affected by Hurricane Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
That was, watch a couple of news pieces or read a couple articles, and it's pretty widespread that, that the African American community was disproportionately affected by the hurricane. I didn't know if you wanted us to, if we're going to speak to that, pull in another source.
It's interesting because if you'd asked me that question this morning, I probably would have said, yeah, that's fine. I had a student, and because we went over this unit this morning in class, and I had a student bring forth a great source that she had pulled that was all in demographic information. And it made me realize that we say that a lot. We say that, just like I said it just a few minutes ago, that, African Americans were disproportionately impacted by Hurricane Katrina. And when you really kind of have to tease that out a little bit if you're being, if you actually really look at the data. Because I think she pulled, I want to say it was a source from FEMA, or she just talked about it, so I didn't see it. I'll see it in her paper. But it talked about how there's about 700,000 people that were impacted, and 40%. 40% were below age 18 and over age 65. And she went through the racial makeup, and it was almost like 50-50 African American and white. And so I was a little bit like, I was kind of taken aback by that, but I think what it is that we talk about it and especially, are concerned about, I think for this specific example and in general, is that it's what does that mean, quote unquote, to be impacted? Right. Because you may have been displaced from your home. You also may have had insurance that could have, paid for another home or there was, so it's sort of like, if we say that people who were poor, regardless of race, were disproportionately impacted, and again, I think I would recommend citing some specific numbers on that. It's about what exactly does that impact look like? Is it because they were displaced for longer? Is it because they, didn't have proper, flood or other types of insurance for their home, so they were completely displaced? Were they in public housing versus, owning a home? There's a number of those kinds of different factors. So I think if you can it may be helpful for you to just sort of think about a certain angle or perspective and just, focus on that and knowing that that's okay. Because there's so many issues with this that you could pick. It's kind of like just, pick one that you care about and talk about that. Okay. And that's going to be okay. So I do think that that being said, I agree with you that there is some general stuff. I would just, keep it pretty general. And if you have one source that can cite it, then that's fine.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay, good question. Jeremy, did you have a question, comment? No? Okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay, you're good. All right, are there any other questions?
I have a question.
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go first.
Okay. My question is on the sources. So I seen somewhere that it said that in each unit it would specify how many sources we need to have on the CTE. So are we needing, in our CTE, do we need to cite each of the articles that were in the required reading? Do we need to have those and be able to cite something from them, or just if we use information from them, cite them?
Oh, absolutely. The only reason to cite a source is if you actually use it. So definitely don't just list things just to list things. The grading anchors that are outlined under the overview of CTEs tab on Blackboard could really be your guidepost, because they, and again, they're general. I call them anchors because they're not, perfect. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, they had 73% of the, articles, not 75. I'm not going to be that particular about it. I'm going to look at it in total. But they should be some guideposts for you. And one of those guideposts says, use 75% of the required readings. Well, if there are 8 required readings and you use 5, and then you go and get another legitimate source, academic source, like a government report or something like that, then, that's going to be great. I don't require you, it's a little bit confusing and because I have it in different parts, I don't require you to cite an additional source. But it definitely can be helpful if you do that, especially when you're trying to kind of gather more contextual information that's specific to the CTE as opposed to the what else is covered in the required readings. So look at those grading anchors again if it's maybe been a little while since you looked at them, and hopefully that will help answer some of your questions about kind of how many sources you should use. Some people can really use all of the same, can use all of the required readings, and then, some CTEs that's harder to do. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, great. Probably a little more than you asked for too. Was there another question?
I had a question, but that actually made me rethink my CTE. My first question was, do you have any suggestions on avoiding secondary sources when we're reading literary or literature reviews?
You said, I'm sorry, I was rustling. I didn't quite understand. Did you say?
I'm sorry. When we're reading like reviews of the literature, how do we avoid citing secondary sources?
Okay, so like more like a meta-analysis or something?
Yeah, because a lot of these have a lot of references and they're very heavy on citing other sources, and I was trying to figure out how to use the required articles when they're
if they're there's a like I said earlier, there's a way to do that. I just for something like that, especially if the article itself is a meta-analysis, then I think it's fine to just cite the article. And you can even, there's a way to sort of say, in a review of the research done by, cite the name. You can kind of put it in a little bit of context, but that's what I was saying. You use a lot of your real estate when you only have 250 words by doing that, because you're using kind of extra words to sort of explain and put a disclaimer in there, or kind of give more information, which makes it appropriate. That's an appropriate use of a secondary source. So I would say avoid that if you can, but it's certainly fine if you have something that's something that the whole purpose of the article is a lit review, then that makes sense. And just as a gentle reminder, with the issue with secondary sources is also that, if you just cite, if you kind of don't go to that original source, you're making, you're taking what is in that journal article at face value. And you're kind of accepting their analysis or interpretation of somebody else's research. But if you go and pull that original article and you read it yourself, you can make your own interpretation and then use your own words to really, expound on that point. So that's another reason why, we want you to shy away from using secondary sources, is because we don't want you to just, take what somebody said at face value and just assume because it's printed, sort of like everything you read on the internet is true. It's kind of like, just because it's a published article doesn't, that's legitimate because it's peer reviewed and all of that. But at the same time, we want you to be thinking critically about this material as well, and not just assuming that somebody's opinion is right. You follow me on that?
Yes, thank you.
That's a good question. Are there any other general CTE related questions, or any general content questions, or anything else, just general? Okay. Well, the plan for today, I hope that everybody was able to review the documentary on stress, Portrait of a Killer. It was about 56 minutes long. Did y'all watch it? There's a lot of good stuff in there. You see all about the baboons. Yes? No?
Yes.
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 I get a lot out of that. I hope y'all got a lot out of that too. And then as well, Dr. Combs-Orm's recorded lecture, we have the benefit of those every week. I'm very happy that y'all have those. She's definitely good. I'm glad you liked it. Happy that you have that. And I think that she really went over the more technical aspects of the physiological response system, that we have a very elegant stress response system that is there and it's active and it's going, whether or not that threat is our amygdala just doesn't know if a threat is real or if it's just a perceived threat. Is it a cat in the kitchen or is it a burglar? You hear a crash, you don't know. And so it's not really until your PFC, your prefrontal cortex comes back online to say, oh, no amygdala, that stimulus is actually just, my kitty cat. So, this whole HPA response system is going on all the time. And it's important for us to understand that, because as social workers, you're being trained to deal with and to work with and intervene with people who are under constant stress. And as social workers, you all are going to be under constant stress. So understanding that stress is real, it's not pretend, just like they said in the video. This is not, mushy-gushy stuff. This is, serious health issues that are related to chronic stress. So being, kind of one of my plugs for self-care or we care is just understanding, where's your threshold? At what point are you as social workers feeling overwhelmed, and what are you doing to take care of yourself, and what are you doing to advocate for healthy relationships and healthy working environments in whatever whatever work environment that you're in. And as a supervisor, some of y'all are going to be future supervisors, whether in clinical practice or macro or meso practice. It's going to be really important because you're going to be setting the tone for everybody that you work with from an organizational standpoint. So you can help kind of create stress in people's lives or help prevent stress in people's lives. And when you think that, chronic stress literally takes years off of your life, understanding how stress relates to you on both a personal and professional standpoint is really, really important. So my little disclaimer, or not disclaimer, but my little soapbox there for self-care. So would like to kind of jump from Dr. Combs-Orm's, conversations about the technical aspects of the stress response and move into, how stress relates to trauma and the whole trauma cycle and adverse childhood experiences. I hope that y'all were able to review all the ACEs material, and I'm really curious to see, especially those of you all who are not living and working in Tennessee, what the sort of ACEs movement is like in your state. I'm happy to talk with you about that either today or offline at any time. It's one of my personal areas of interest that I'm involved with outside of the classroom as well. So curious what your take is on all of that. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up the PowerPoint. Okay. So moving on from Dr. Combs-Orm's conversation about, stress, and I think she covered this a little bit, but I just wanted to underscore it, is, not all stress is bad. Having some kind of external push and internal push can really create an optimal sort of balance between, stress and performance. You don't want to be, oops, oh gosh. My mouse is extremely sensitive. I lost it right here. Wow, went way down. Okay, so one of the issues is, finding that balance between, appropriate stress and performance. And you don't want to be, down here where you're, sleeping and you have kind of low alertness because, you're just, not really stressed. And, you also don't want to be over here where you're just have this kind of rampant anxiety, as many of you, I'm sure, going to school full time and working full time and maybe taking care of, families, children, or parents, or all of this just kind of regular demands of life. You really can get overloaded and, be under, high stress, and then, be suffering from this low performance. So, where you just, you don't feel good, you've got some psychosomatic symptoms, you got physiological symptoms, and, just not really kind of at your peak performance. So there is a nice balance here that can be, important to consider for both yourself and your clients. Are there any questions about that? Okay, I'm going to move along and just talk about the trauma response system. And trauma is one of those things. It's almost become a little jargony term that's lost its meaning. And I wanted to take an opportunity to, even if you've been exposed to information about trauma before, I'm sure some of this is going to be really familiar to many of you. At least I hope so. And if it's all new, then that's great too. But just know that a lot of times we overuse the term trauma, and want to bring us back to center around, what is it really? And how do we figure out is something just sort of, slightly stressful, or is it really, is it truly traumatic? So one of the ways we do that is we think about the 3 E's, which is just thinking about the experience of an event by a person that is emotionally painful or distressful, and which often results in lasting mental and physical effects. And this last piece about the lasting mental and physical effects is one of the kind of, big markers for us about, is someone, truly kind of quote unquote traumatized from that experience. Because just because you're exposed to an adverse event, or even something that could be considered truly traumatic, does not mean that you are going to become traumatized in that you may not have any lasting mental or physical effects. So that's one of the important things to consider. There's a number of different traumatic events, abuse, neglect, victimization, violence, accident, illness, natural disaster, war, terrorism, kind of sudden death of a loved one. There's definitely, things that aren't on this list, but so these are just, individual events. You can also have kind of collective events like, war or terrorism, or maybe it's, one event and it kind of lasts for a very long time. Traumatic experiences are generally, or can be, life-threatening, overwhelming. They also are very subjective and can be an internal state. It's one of the ways that there's so much individual variation is because, the experience, and just like we've been learning with the whole epigenetic piece and just general kind of brain development pieces, all of development is very individualized because it's about how our internal states meet the environment, and so it can be very, very subjective. Obviously varies between people, and it can definitely vary over time with the same person, and developmental considerations always need to be developmental levels always need to be taken into consideration. And that's one thing that I recommend that you try to address in your CTEs is if you're talking about a specific population who's experienced this stress, which may, this kind of unique traumatic experience, which may lead to chronic stress, then, how does that impact them at their developmental level? Just in the same way that for the brain unit CTE, you needed to take into consideration how that 17-year-old, where were they in the process of their brain development, experiencing the trauma of, displacement and a hurricane, when you're 2 is going to be very different from 8, is going to be very different from 15, is going to be very different from 85. So taking into those things, thinking about those things will also be important to your CTE. And trauma, of course, can be a single incident, or it can be chronic incidents. Some symptoms of some of these lasting effects that I've been talking about can be, nightmares, flashbacks, in kind of constant fight or flight, hyperarousal, things like dissociation or, cutting, misinterpretation of cues and overreaction. We can definitely see this in people who may have experienced something violent, maybe, raised in a violent environment. They may just kind of always be sort of primed for sort of reactivity. And so you may be walking towards them. They may feel that that's threatening when really you're just walking towards them. We see that definitely a lot in the classroom with children. So there's a number of things that can be individualized and that need to be considered. As I kind of said, most people can get through an adverse experience without developing symptoms of trauma. Trauma is also one of those things for those of you who are going into clinical practice. It's really critical that you look at, differentiating your, having a differential diagnosis and essentially, screening out trauma, because so many, when you kind of go back to this list, so many of these, behaviors, these kind of externalizing behaviors can look like any number of things on, the DSM. So figuring out, okay, is this truly some other, bipolar disorder or depression or something else, or really do they, have they experienced trauma and they, maybe not quite simply need to deal with, but they, if you address the trauma, essentially a lot of these issues will go away. And so it's important to understand, are you really, diagnosing somebody appropriately? Resilience and protective factors contribute to how and, if a person is affected. This is one of those things, we don't have control over a lot of things, but when we're supporting young people as they grow and develop, if they have, good agency, if they have good, internal locus of control, if they're, self-focused and know that they can, move through adversity or, solve problems, that's really going to act as a protective factor than somebody who's potentially never experienced any adversity. So there's kind of a balance between having too much adversity and not enough adversity, because if you don't ever experience anything that you really need to work through, then how do you know that you can get through something, when inevitably something difficult does transpire? There's definitely a lot of debate about that out there in the field. Recovery is most definitely possible. That's definitely where social workers come into play, and how we're in the business of being, agents of hope and agents of change for people. So I want to dive in. I definitely want to make sure we have time for some of your thoughts on the CTE. So I'm gonna move through this relatively quickly, but please stop me if y'all have some questions, or if you want me to speed up, slow down, just let me know. So I want to get into the cycle of trauma, and I'm gonna actually make this big. Okay. So if we look at trauma and look at some case examples, one of the issues with trauma is, I kind of talk about, we can think about internal locus of control and external locus of control. And one of the things that comes into play is how do people respond to what happened, to something traumatic that's happening, and how people respond, especially immediately after the crisis, almost regardless of how old you are, becomes really, really important. So these are some examples to just walk us through this trauma response cycle. So you have, just for example, 3 6-year-old female victims of sexual assault by a neighbor. So kind of same community, same street, maybe even. So one of them tells their parent, and they get supported and they're nurtured. They have their emotional and physical needs met, and even go so far as to prosecute the neighbor. So even though the young girl is just 6 years old, she still has some perceptions about, kind of justice being done, and somebody, an adult did a bad thing and they were, held accountable for that. So that's one example. Another example is that somebody doesn't tell anybody. So it's, the 6-year-old experienced this assault and just simply keeps it to herself, which unfortunately is more common than we would like. And last example is, somebody tells, they get assaulted, tells their mom, and mom responds in such a way that says, what in the heck were you doing there? What did you do? How could you let that happen? And really goes into essentially some victim blaming, and it's much more about, what did you do, and this is your fault kind of a frame. And what can happen, if I can advance my slides, there's a number of different things that can happen as a result of this trauma. So in the first example, we might actually see a full, kind of cycle of this trauma being resolved. And, because essentially if the assault is acknowledged, the needs are taken care of, we even go and see that the person was held accountable for their actions. There simply may be no lasting negative effects. That's not guaranteed, but that's an ideal situation where we may see the actual resolution of a very serious issue. And, so you've got this trauma, during that trauma, this person is experiencing, fight, flight, or freeze, which, the whole HPA axis system comes online. You have all the hormones released. You have a system that becomes overwhelmed. And, but then when there's a resolution, everything can go back to normal. Your cortisol kicks in, reduces your adrenaline spikes, and helps the body return back to homeostasis, and that kind of neutral state is ready to respond again to future traumas. When you get that resolution, you essentially potentially have a better chance of not having any lasting effects. Similarly, I talked about the crash in the kitchen. That's a cat. You realize it's a cat. Everything kind of goes back to normal. So there's an issue though when some of this stuff, when it doesn't get resolved. And, many of the folks that you all will be working with as social workers, we deal every day with vulnerable populations, and many of the people will have experienced, have trauma histories of one degree or another. So I want to walk through this and talk about the importance of the worldview or inner working model and how it relates to this whole cycle that we can tend to see every day when these traumas are not resolved. So you can have this traumatic event. As a result of that event, you're going to have lots of thoughts and feelings and beliefs. And those thoughts and feelings or beliefs are going to collectively create what can be considered a worldview, or, and generally your inner working model. And then it's the result of these things that actually motivate and generate and cause these possible behaviors, which also look like symptomology or can be considered, presenting symptoms in a clinical setting. And some examples of those are, especially with our first little girl, we talked about, having these beliefs, that can be even related to how her parent responded to her, what did I do? And lots of shame, and I am bad, I am dirty, something is wrong with me. And those thoughts and feelings create this idea of, I am unsafe, or I am unloved, and also the world is unsafe. And, there's not love to be had in the world. And it's really this, a lot of people refer to this as like a core belief system. And I'm sure that, everybody online right now has some version of this. Many of it's, it's very good. We all have an inner working model, whether it's positive or negative. It's all there. We all have core belief systems. But things like trauma can really lead to these belief systems that can lead to some really negative behaviors like social isolation, aggression, and other things, kind of mental illness related things. Definitely self-medicating behaviors like other addictive behaviors like food, sex, drugs and alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, any number of things. So what this actually can look like, when trauma is unresolved, is you get into this piece here where you have these kind of coping behaviors. And you wind up being in this cycle of having, this coping behavior, or you're getting triggered. So say, for example, you experienced, an assault or some kind of an abuse, and it was not resolved. You're constantly at risk of being, of that original trauma kind of coming back online through a trigger. Like, for example, if you look at have a veteran who, was involved in lots of, kind of constant exposure to, bombs, to gunfire, never knew where the, enemy was coming from, may come home, be sitting in the house, everything's, fine in a very safe environment. And then, outside a car backfires, or a lawnmower starts, or, fireworks are going off, next door neighbor, something loud, that person can be immediately, triggered into this fight, flight, or freeze. And again, the amygdala is receiving this stimulus, and they're not making the determination whether that threat is real or perceived. So they have the exact same response. So fighting through traffic, feel the same, just like they talked about the video, can feel the same as, it's the same system, same hormones as, if you were a zebra being chased, by a lion and running for your life. So, this overwhelms our system, and then which leads to these coping behaviors, which can look like any number of things, just depending. So, you don't feel good, your system's overwhelmed, you're tired, you're fatigued, so you drink caffeine, you're scared, so you, take drugs that sort of suppress your anxiety, whether they're prescribed or not. There's a number of different things that are related to this. And, we can kind of go round and round on this cycle until we, until essentially this kind of core trauma is really resolved. And this is where a lot of social workers will meet, clients where they are, is they're I kind of call it this sort of trigger wheel or trigger cycle. You see a lot of relationship patterns, emotionally abusive patterns, physically abusive patterns, any number of things, kind of whatever the source of that trauma is, and that trigger can really, just kind of keep on going until it has the opportunity to be resolved. So I'm going to pause there and see if you all have any questions about any of that. We talk about, stress. It's important to talk about stress and trauma, I think, together, because, they really are related. So chronic stress may not necessarily be a trauma, but it definitely, you have the same physiological systems at play in both of them. So, some examples of unresolved stress and trauma. We talked earlier units about mundane extreme environmental stress, or MEES. This can look like a series of microaggressions. Kindling. This is a whole concept that kind of, it's just also sort of microaggressions are implicated here too. Is essentially a lot of small triggers, a lot of small adversities can have the same impact as one big adversity. Oh gosh, there it goes again. Complex trauma, developmental trauma. This is trauma that we've seen, especially this typically relates to very young children who experience kind of layer upon layer upon layer of trauma, separation from parents, abuse. Maybe they get pulled from their homes because of an abusive situation, get put in foster care. Maybe the foster family is also abusive. Maybe there's a kind of chronic lack of nutrition. So their, growth and development, both physically and, with their brain development, can be really stunted. You look at things like Romanian orphanages where babies are just not really nurtured. Their brain structure and even the mass of their brain is different than babies who are raised in a more nurturing environment. So there's a number of things involved with this whole piece around trauma and chronic stress. So I think a lot of the ACE information, that the ACE study was such a landmark piece for our field, for actually all fields in the kind of social services, social sciences, hard sciences, just anything related to health. It's critical. It was the first time we really understood that, adverse events in childhood had long-lasting effects into adulthood, and could, especially with increased numbers, just increase our risk of even early death. And this is another reason that we talk about adverse childhood experiences here, is that it really, all of those adverse experiences in childhood, really prime the system for kind of lifelong chronic stress. If we're not nurtured enough, we do not develop the, I'm not gonna be able to say this right. The receptors that Dr. Combs-Orm talked about in the brain, we're not able to essentially process stress. We're not able to essentially handle the stress that's coming our way. So all of these things become very compounded, and year after year after year, you're going to have things like a higher baseline level of blood pressure, adrenaline, higher heart rate. People just kind of have a higher, resting heart rate. Anybody who works out a lot knows that that's not a good thing. Years of elevated blood pressure, stress hormones, all of these things can result in susceptibility to infection. Remember, because when your fight or flight system is online, your immune system is offline, your digestive system is offline, your hippocampus is impaired, your ability to learn, problems with attention, poor impulse control, that kind of reactivity and overreaction that we talked about, tendency to violence or, lash out. In most places, our kids involved in our juvenile justice systems, depending on, what the population is, but anywhere from like 70, 65, even to up to 90% of the kids involved in the juvenile justice system have a history of being adjudicated dependent neglect, which essentially means that, they were in the child welfare system before they were in the juvenile justice system. So they've got, really intense trauma histories. And, then they're in a very intense traumatic environment, just, essentially being in baby jail. So there's a number of issues around, at the population level when we look at people who experience chronic stress. So I'm going to pause here before we jump into the ACE study a little bit. Are there any questions, or anybody have any comments about this whole trauma cycle and issues of chronic stress? No question. All right, I'm going to touch on the ACE study. There's a huge amount of information. I hope that you all were able to, get into the ACE study. But essentially, like I said, it's very common. Adverse childhood experiences are common. And the whole purpose of that whole study helps us understand our increased risk. So just because you have a high number of ACEs doesn't mean that you're going to, develop all of these, negative health outcomes. The Tennessee specific report, many states now are reporting it at a state level, even a county level. So I encourage you, if you're not in Tennessee, to look for some of those resources that are out there. Very, very important. And I love the frame that they really introduce all of this information. They say, ACEs are fact, not fate. They don't determine the rest of our lives, but they can if they're essentially not, acknowledged or addressed. And it's kind of, ACEs sort of create a whole other cycle. Got a graphic here. This is a very new graphic I just came across. The ACE study helped us understand this kind of original ACE pyramid. Talked about, here are the adverse childhood experiences here. Essentially, those ACEs, when experienced, created social, emotional, and cognitive impairment as kids were getting older, which that impairment led to the adoption of health risk behaviors, and which then led to disease, disability, and social problems. And even for people who have 6 or more ACEs, can lead to a risk of early death by 20 years. So there, and all of this is based on that original study, which has been replicated, and it's been, studied and studied and studied. There's like something like 50 articles that were published on ACEs just in 2016 alone. So no matter what demographic you look at, all of these outcomes hold. And what can be very specific to our population, what we care about as social workers is the this whole idea of kind of trauma and social location, and looking at the intergenerational transfer of epigenetic stress that we talked about a couple weeks ago, and looking at the broader context for trauma that results from wars, genocide, poverty, sexism, racism, and high levels of violence experienced by some communities. So you kind of have this whole ACE issue or complex trauma that is, overlaid on top of these larger historical trauma or generational issues that can come into play. So all of this, another way to look at it is allostatic load and disrupted neurological development. And then, like we've been talking about with this trauma response cycle, you have these coping behaviors that then can lead to the burden of disease, distress, and even, criminalization and stigmatization. I mean, in some cases, mental illness is essentially criminalized, and again, leading to early death. So there's a number of factors that are important when we're talking about, trauma and stress. So I am going to stop here with our conversations from the slides, and definitely encourage you to review them if you haven't reviewed them already. And would like to jump to a conversation with you all about the CTE specifically, and would love to hear more from you. Really just kind of want to put the class in your hands. My face-to-face students each week have an opportunity to teach the class, about the CTEs. And so I know that you all aren't working, they do that in groups. I know y'all are, I'm not going to ask y'all to jump in groups right now, but would love to hear just some general perspectives from you all to share with not just me, but the rest of the class on just kind of what were some of your takeaways when you were writing the CTE? What were some of your points that you wanted to make sure that you got across when you were writing your CTEs? I know you all have written them.
I guess I'll say it. So I focused more on the children aspect because that's the population I want to work with more. And I guess I just tried to drive home the fact that, this was out of their control, and it would have such a big impact on them in the future and in their children and grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And it's something that could be prevented through therapy, through cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff like that. If you're proactive, we might not have the resources to, give them a new home, to make sure that their home lives are perfect, but we can give them skills and help them cope with stress that they're going to endure every day, to help them kind of go forward in their life.
Yeah, excellent. I love the way that you're thinking and definitely kind of pulling it back. Talking about, interventions for these issues is a really good way to kind of tie all this stuff up in a nice, pretty bow, especially in 250 words. So, you can't get all the details that you want to in there, but definitely, interventions are a good way to kind of bring everything together. So good. Excellent. Who else would like to share? I know y'all don't want me to call on you.
Excuse me. What I focused on was the prevalence of mental health diagnoses among children after the event. And what I found was that 62% of children they were more likely to suffer from PTSD or some type of separation anxiety. And I thought that it was interesting how that kind of event would trigger that type of experience among the children.
Great. So were there any more specific details about, like, did you find in your research that, really kind of connected those dots and said, this is why we're seeing that? Like, so we see a connection, we're seeing that 62% figure, but did they kind of elucidate a little further on what that connection was or why specifically?
Well, the children that were 62% more likely, they were the ones that stayed in the city, whereas 43% that left, they had less likely were to have PTSD.
Yeah, great.
So I guess continue to stay in the environment that was affected increased the likelihood of having the PTSD.
Great. I think that makes a lot of sense. Wow, that sounds like a great resource. Sounds like a good one. Good. So kind of staying, so you experience a trauma and then you have to stay in that place where it's, things are continuing to maybe not get better. Maybe they're actually kind of degrading in some way. You're displaced and then you're home, but you're not home, or there's probably a number of issues, with staying in that environment. So that makes a lot of sense. Good. Thanks, Tyler. What are some other thoughts that you have?
I kind of focused on how it's not just the original stress of the storm that's going to cause a problem, but that it's going to cause the impact of the storm and how people were developing, how that's going to cause the children of the people who experienced the storm to also be more stressed individuals and potentially have more difficult times just coping with things, which might affect the grandchildren, and how this is essentially one storm that's not just going to take a few years to rebuild stuff. It's going to take multiple generations to grow out of. That it's kind of like a web of stress rather than just one event of stress now.
Yeah, so that's great. So can you talk about that a little bit more about what those connections, kind of, sort of how that web actually works, like how would you connect the dots between, so someone who, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly too, so that you have somebody who experienced the storm, but then they have kids or then they have grandkids, and kind of how that web actually works.
Right. So I kind of focused on I did my best in 10 or 50 words to kind of start it out with, like, let's say you have a mother who has a child, and the mother is now more stressed, and so her stress raising of the child is going to make the child more likely to have a stressed parenting style. Right. Or if it was an adolescent during the storm, the stress of the storm is going to cause their children to possibly have higher cortisol levels, or they're more likely to develop mental health disorders, which is going to cause a stress on the family. That the first generation children, because of the stress, that it's a repeating process now that it's been kind of started, that it's just kind of a snowball that's just going to have to work its way out.
Right.
Hopefully sooner rather than later.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, because we do know, the whole, epigenetic transfer of stress can happen in one generation. So how that's affecting our genetics, and we know what we're passing down to our children. And, that's still a field that we're still learning about. It's a very, very new field. And, but definitely all the research out there is really pointing in that direction. And, but again, it's very, very individualized. So we don't know that that's going to happen to every single person, but the likelihood and the risk is absolutely elevated. And I think that's a really good point. I think it also goes back to Augusta's point about, interventions. So, needing that kind of depth and breadth of interventions, access to interventions if you're in rural areas, or maybe, you go from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, or you go from New Orleans to, Houston, what are your insurance issues that are happening? One of my students talked about how, Hurricane Katrina happened at the, very start of the school year. Some kids were pulled out of school for extended period of time, and kind of compounding effects of that, and, missing their educational benchmarks. And so there's all these kind of layers upon layers upon layers. And I think your description of a web is really exciting. I think it makes a lot of sense. And, and I think there's the individual web kind of at the family level, but it's also very much at the community level too, right?
Yeah.
So, all those different things like social services that need to be rebuilt, hospitals that were flooded and need to be gutted, and, it's kind of continued access to resources in healthcare is very, very diminished for New Orleans for a long, long time. Good. Excellent. So what are some other thoughts? Y'all are having great thoughts.
Speaking epigenetically, I found an article that showed a male father rat that was paired with a shock and a odor, and the offspring who had never been shocked but had never been introduced to the odor had smelt the odor and showed a fear response. So I kind of tied that back into with adverse effects of parents and then their offspring having, that type of could possibly have that type of experience with fear with adverse experiences.
Yeah, excellent. Who was that one by? Do you remember?
Diaz and Wrestler.
Okay.
So.
Awesome. This is why it's exciting when y'all can go and find, go do your own research and find some additional articles. It's, there's so much that we have to learn. And, it's one of the reasons why I love challenging you all to really think critically about, how do you apply this information? I mean, it's intense, it's dense, but it's also extremely relevant. And I think that, you all with your individual experiences, your personal experiences, your professional experiences, each of you may see something that, the next social worker next to you, doesn't see. So, keeping along those lines of, looking at this material through the lens of what you care about and what you're passionate about is really exciting, because you're going to be able to then contribute to the field in ways that other people don't. So I love that you were looking at that. Great. What are some other thoughts? What are some other, does anybody have a different angle that wasn't related to children or families that they decided to focus on? Did everybody focus on kids? I mean, not that I'm mine. I mean, because that's my thing. But I know I'm not. I know that that's not the only population out there that y'all care about.
I had a thought, and it wasn't my full thought for the CTE, but the lack of or how social support can really affect the trauma that you're experiencing, and how sad it must have been, and how scary with all these people just had to evacuate out of their town and around all the people that they knew and that they leaned on. And it just adds insult to injury, and what that must feel like. We're a military family, and we are moving all the time. So I understand what it's like to need that social support, and then for it just to be gone in the chaos, and what that must feel like in the long term, and having to rebuild that and make connections with your family, and how hard that would be on top of the trauma of losing your home, so.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It reminds me of, social supports, just like you're saying, they're a huge protective factor across the board. Doesn't, SES doesn't matter, demographics doesn't matter. I mean, we are, as human beings, we are wired to be social. You see that in the researchers, baboon troops in the stress video in the documentary. And, it's so critical to maintain. And as social workers, you're always going to want to assess for social supports, because that's a strength that they're going to be able to leverage. And you also know that that's potentially, kind of harmful or could be a barrier to success clinically.
Yes.
So I think you bring up, a really good point. And also, the impact of lack of social support, we're starting to see more research around. It's not just social, it's psychological, and now we know physiological. That whole piece around our telomeres and how much we're aging, and how that one study that looked at how parents who are raising children with special needs were aging like 6 years to 1 year in the general population. So if you think about, so maybe it's not the chronic stress of raising a child with special needs, but maybe it's the chronic stress of experiencing a hurricane, being displaced, losing your social supports. You don't have an outlet, you don't have that social support. It's entirely possible, based on that research, that we could conclude that at least there's an elevated risk of kind of increased aging, just related to that stress, and that, you know,
Right.
or telomeres are having to, you know, replicate just too quickly. And
Yeah, I think that was Minook. That was Minook and McCaffrey. That
Yeah.
was from that. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, you know, lots of dots to connect here. Lots of dots to connect. Which is why important, you know, that you all kind of think critically about, you know, how do these dots connect, and why do these dots connect, and, you know, how is that relevant to the social work that you want to practice or that you're practicing now. So good. What are some other comments or questions that you all have? I love the way you're thinking. Your brains are working. Your amygdalas are not hijacked. That's always what I tell my face-to-face students. I need your stress level down so that you can actually learn, perform well on your quizzes. Don't need to hijack your amygdala. So I give y'all 50 minutes, not 15. So what are some other thoughts y'all have?
With mine, I kind of took the same approach that Stephen mentioned of kind of the snowball effect. I kind of just use the facts, kind of build up. It's like, hey, we have not seen what is to come, I guess. But I think more of the approach that I kind of view it in is that I don't think we're ever going to really see all of the ends of the web, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? And then they get really kind of compounded and complicated and complex when, you know, you start having all of these different variables that are, you know, interacting with those different kind of ends of the web or the different spokes on the wheel. I think that makes sense. I don't know that we will ever know. I mean, just like right now, I mean, we're still seeing the end of not really the end, but we're still seeing the impacts from slavery. I mean, happening right now, today. So, you know, definitely epigenetically. So it's, you're right. I think that's astute. Good point. Good. What are some other thoughts?
I looked at the Lupin article, and I liked this one point they made, how stress doesn't necessarily always have to be a negative thing. Like you were saying before, you need it. It's essential to survive. And if you do look at statistics, like people are moving back to New Orleans, it's slowly building up population again. And, you know, people that didn't just run away and stay away, they're back to try and build their community again.
Yeah, so sometimes people, I mean, we see that a lot with you know, victims of all kinds of trauma. They really, you know, it's part of what cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff is, you know, really thinking, you know, how do we think about this narrative? You know, how, you know, what is the story that we tell ourselves about this trauma? You know, how do we cognitively process this trauma? One of the reasons intelligence can be a real factor to consider is, you know, how well are you able to process this? Or, you know, how many different, you know, ways can you think about this? Can you find the silver lining? You know, are you kind of focused on, you know, or is it just for whatever reason harder to come up with a positive narrative? You kind of have negative bias that where you're just kind of a chronically cynical person is going to be harder to see those silver linings like you're talking about, and looking at, you know, yes, let's go back home. Yes, let's see if we can rebuild our city. So, and there's so much individual variation there, and I think that's a good point. It's good to talk about hope. We deal with heavy subjects. We always want to be instilling hope, talking about how recovery is possible, so we know that it is. That's what we're here for. Good. Well, are there any kind of parting questions or other comments y'all would like to share about the CTEs? I'm learning a lot from hearing from you all. I know, I'm sure y'all are too. Go ahead. Is somebody about to talk?
Well, I sort of treated it really broadly, I'm realizing, based on what everybody else has said. And also I found it difficult. I guess this is more of a complaint and then a request for help than anything else, but I found myself filling up the paper with an explanation of the physiology of stress.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there are any pointers, like how to get away from that, how to narrow my point of view.
Yeah, I think thank you for bringing that up. I think you're not the only one. I think a lot of people have struggled with that. And I think, I think some of, and to be general, it's okay. Like there's nothing wrong with being general. So I think one of the ways, I like what a couple of folks have talked about with this whole, web piece and kind of how all of those dots are connecting. So, you experienced a traumatic event. Maybe you already were coming from a place of, deprivation in some way or poverty, or, you were already experiencing chronic stress, kind of overlay that, then you get displaced, then kind of on and on and on. How do these things sort of build on each other? And, and I think going back to that trauma response cycle where you've got this, trigger, fight, flight, or freeze, overwhelm, coping, you have this whole system, that's your HVA axis, at work. And I think that there's, I just encourage you to, I think that, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that you can explain the neurophysiology of stress and that process in such a way that doesn't take up the whole page and take up the whole paper. I think that you can just perhaps limit the details. Like you don't necessarily have to talk about the release of ACTH and, CRF and all of that. I mean, you don't necessarily have to get into that technicality piece. I think you can just talk about how, trying to do this without like writing it for you. Well, let me just pause for a minute. Does that help at all? I mean, is it just, you feel like it's just like you're explaining like every little detail of
That is helpful.
Okay. Because I think it's like you just simply don't have to, because if you talk about the, our physiological stress response system and you talk about the HVA axis and you talk about, the fight or flight, I mean, I think that you can do that in less words. You don't have to explain all of the little pieces of it. Because if you use it in context, I'm going to understand. Because the whole goal is like, part of the goal of the assignment is that I understand that you've read and understood the material. So if you use these vocab terms and concepts directly within the context of answering the CTE prompt, then I'm going to know that you've read and understood the material.
Got it.
It's when like vocabulary and concepts are used incorrectly, which happens sometimes, that's really a clue in for me to say, okay, I'm not sure they're fully, that you're fully grasping this. So you don't necessarily have to say, like for the epigenetics one that, epigenesis is blah, 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 it's like, you don't have to sit there and like define the term, but if you use it correctly, then I'll know you understand.
Right. And I read all of the CTE writing and I mean, all the OWL, all of that stuff. And so I feel like I know that, but when I go to write it, I don't know, the 250th, this is good though. I mean, I'm learning.
Yeah, it's hard. And again, and just another tip, I expect this one to be hardest for you. You've got 2 more that I'll grade after this. I'm going to give everybody as much feedback as I can on this first one for y'all to apply and integrate into your future ones, which probably won't have as much feedback or even need to have as much feedback. So, I take all of that into consideration and just, I think, again, to kind of reduce some of that anxiety and reduce some of that stress, just, know that it should be challenging. It should stretch your brain a little bit. It should be, hard to kind of condense all that stuff into 250 words. But at the end of the day, once you master that skill, you're going to just take it with you. You're going to be able to do it in so many different settings and contexts. And And it's also a helpful reminder and a challenge, for us to realize, is this word really important? Is this, kind of going back to sort of writing 101, like, is there a way that I can synthesize this in a clear manner? Because a lot of times all of our words, clearly y'all can probably tell I'm a big talker. And so, it's like, are all these words really necessary? I do tend to repeat myself over and over again. Is this really valuable? We do that in writing too. So it's a big challenge to ourselves. And that's why I post those exemplars. Those are not me. Those are y'all. Those are all student written papers. A lot of those online students. So, y'all are pretty fabulous. And I think that the first one will be, I expect it to be a little harder, but I think it'll get easier over time. And like I said before, I'll repeat myself. There's no replacement for just kind of struggling through it, doing the best job you can. So.
If it helps, I had that same problem. I started out and I wrote the whole stress process out, and I realized I had 170 words doing that and had used 2 sources. So I just had to cut it. And
you're probably better for it at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was not going anywhere when I did that.
Right.
But I started with the same place and I had the same problem with it. So the only thing I'm really concerned about now is secondary sources. It's like I know what they are and I know how to avoid them. It's just kind of that lingering, did I avoid them? Did I do them?
Right.
150 words.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not going to be too overly concerned about that. So don't stress about that too much. Just know that it's a thing, and I am asking you to critically think. So don't just take, everything written on the internet is true kind of perspective.
Okay. So it's not like if we accidentally did it, it'll like tank our grade or anything. It's just
no.
Okay.
I take all that stuff into consideration the first time. So no, don't lose any sleep over that one.
Okay.
It's just a reminder that this is, we're all learning together, and this is a process, and so I'll just expect you to figure it out as you move forward.
Okay.
Good.
I actually had a couple of comments. I felt like today's class was very helpful because I was extremely overwhelmed and just didn't really know which direction to take. So I too was very broad and probably went over the limit. So this is, helping me to condense. A couple of questions. First, going forward, are the CTEs due on Mondays now instead of the Sundays? That's a definite.
That's a definite. I take your feedback seriously. And so I definitely got a lot of feedback saying, just like you said, we really get a lot out of hearing you talk and then participating in the discussion. And, it makes more sense to just like the quizzes, have it due. And the only reason they were due before, it doesn't make any difference to me from a grading standpoint, whether it's Sunday or Monday or from a timeline standpoint. It was really just about, I want to make sure that y'all had them done so that we could have a more meaningful discussion and y'all would know the kind of questions to ask because we have such limited time together. So that was really the motivation for that. It wasn't to make your life harder. It was really just to make sure that it was, you were able to come to class prepared and, have a more meaningful discussion. So, the remaining 2 CTEs that are graded will be due on Monday night instead of Sunday.
Okay, good. My next question was regarding the highlighted vocabulary. All of those have to be in the CTE, correct?
So, and I apologize for if I did not make this clear earlier in the semester. I very much apologize. I couldn't remember if I had corrected it every place or not, or said it in our intro. So the issue with the bolded vocabulary terms is that I used to I did an experiment this summer where I had some vocabulary words and I found, if everybody could mute their line, that might make it easier to hear. Thank you. If everybody, what I found is that it actually, I feel like I got worse CTEs. I feel like it inhibited people's sort of creativity because they were like so focused on, I have to get this word in, I have to get this word in, I have to get this word in. So what I've done is this semester is a compromise on, I've left the highlights and bolded ones to say kind of, these are the key ones that I think are related to this particular CTE. Would be helpful if you could use them. They're also the key ones. I mean, they're all important, but they're also sort of key ones for future classes and comps and all that kind of stuff. So, so the issue is, if it's helpful to you to have a goal, because oftentimes there's like over 10, vocabulary words. And if it's helpful to you to write the CTE trying to use the bolded words, then go forth and prosper and work that process and do that. If it's not helpful to you, you can completely ignore them. I do not grade. The take-home point is I do not grade based on the bolded and highlighted terms. So they're there for your benefit if it's helpful. Because some people, I did hear from my face-to-face students, some people, it was almost like half the class was like, yes, I like them, thank you. And then the other half was like, no, that makes me crazy, and I just want to ignore them. So great. So both options are perfectly fine.
Okay, great. And my last question, if you don't mind, is just regarding the in-text citation.
Yes.
In relation to the 250 words.
Yes.
So do we just, for instance, it's definitely going to go over 250 because you're not counting, I'm sorry, let me explain this correctly.
Yes.
You're not counting the in-text citation towards the 250.
No, ma'am, no.
Okay, so if my computer says 265,
yes.
I would just subtract. I'm sorry, not to get technical, but
no, I literally do this when I'm grading them, so you're not being overly technical. So I just will look, and it'll say word count, and it'll say, sometimes it'll even be like 301, but then I'll look, and it's like every single article, you've got an in-text citation where you've cited 3 authors on one point. I mean, so it's like, it's very clear that there's a lot. So absolutely, it's that makes sense. So no, I don't count those towards the 250 word limit for that very reason. Is because it gets way out of hand real quick.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. So
sorry. Another question. So regarding the word count, I literally went through today and counted all the different names and years, and then subtracted them, and then I just put the word count towards the 250 that I had.
Yeah, that's what I do. Perfect. Good job.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Did I have one question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the articles that we read, there's sometimes words that are highlighted.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason for that?
I cannot get those off. Sorry about that. I can't get them off. So that if they're helpful to you, great. If they're not helpful, ignore them. If they're annoying, I'm sorry.
I just wasn't sure if you're like, this is important, this is not, or like.
I've tried to fiddle with them and get them. It's the copy that I inherited, and I can't do anything.
Okay, cool.
Sorry about that. Good question. Well, you are not the first person to have that question.
I got them off somehow before, and I don't know how I did it.
If you figure it out, let me know, because I can't tell you. So I had one question about just turning in the CTEs. So and I tried to make this clear on the syllabus, and if it's not clear, I'll just make sure I correct it here. Is you only have those 3 CTEs that are graded, and all of those are under the upload CTEs here link. Those are the only CTEs that you have to turn in for a grade. The other CTEs are there for your practice, because if you do them every week, they help you study for the quiz. They help you make sure you're understanding the material, because if you can write about it, then you know it. So it's another opportunity for you to be integrating this information, making sure that you really understand it, especially since we don't get to meet every week. So you don't have to turn those other ones in. However, my little carrot is don't forget that 3-point extra credit opportunity is there for you at the end of the semester, which can make a big difference in your grade if you choose to take advantage of that. And that extra credit comes from those non-graded CTEs. So you will be able to turn in one of those CTEs that you wrote during the week that, or during the weeks that we have quizzes as opposed to the graded CTEs. So hopefully that answers that question. If it doesn't, let me know. Okay, good. We're good.
Wait. So you turn the non-graded CTs in when you take the quizzes?
No. So
you just turn them in at the end of the semester?
No, you don't turn them in at all, except for you can turn in one that you choose as your best one for your potential 3-point extra credit opportunity. So, but other than that, it's just there for you for practice each week. And again, if you do them each week, then by the time you get to the one that you turn in for a grade, that's just more practice under your belt. So it's really for practice. And I know that's probably a little weird. You're like, wait, you're asking me to do stuff, but it's not graded. I'm so, I know that's like probably not normal, or that's just a different thing than you may have experienced in the past. But it's truly, again, as I said in intro, what you put into this class is what you get out of it. So I know you may not be able to do them every single week, but they are truly there for your benefit. And if I had less students, I'd be doing those every week instead of the quizzes, but it's not possible for me. I'm only human. Well, I really look forward to reading your CTEs. I'm excited. I get a lot of my best CTEs from online students, so I'm very excited to hear your perspectives. So are there any last questions in our last couple of minutes of class?
I just want to clarify one last time. My headphone kind of cut out for a second. The highlighted vocab words, we don't have to use all of those.
They are not required. They're there for kind of guidance if it's helpful to you. If it's not helpful, then you can ignore them.
Okay.
But yeah, you do need to be using some of the vocabulary words at least.
Okay. Yeah, it's not all too much.
Yeah, not all of the vocabulary words are going to tie directly to the CTE, so it wouldn't be fair, to ask you to do that. So.
Yeah, because I was thinking about changing my CTE, just tweaking it, and then now I need to not do that. I got happy with it.
At some point, you just got to stop. But.
Yeah. Because I had to cram some of those in. Like, I was like, how do I fit cortisol in?
Yeah. Cortisol is kind of important, but that's okay.
Yeah, I finally fit it in with cortisol levels at pregnancy.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, it's been awesome hanging out with y'all. I hope you had a good time. I hope you learned something. I'm glad that we could do this. I wish we could do this every week, but you're probably relieved that we don't. So any final parting words of wisdom, comments? All right. I try to be responsive to your emails, so please, if y'all are stuck running into issues or don't understand something, please stay in touch with me. I'm here to support your learning, and I'll be providing as much feedback as I can. My turnaround time is about 2 weeks on your CTE, so you can get ready for the next one. I'm going to try real hard to meet that deadline. All right. Well, y'all have a great rest of the night, and I will see y'all again in a couple weeks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.